Okay, good evening to everybody who is listening to the session from Brazil and neighboring countries, and also from Europe. I should probably say good afternoon to those of you who are following us from the United States. And I'll say good morning to James Loxton, who is our discussant joining us from Australia. I'm very pleased to open the first session of the workshop on the politics of the new right in Latin America. This event is the result of a major comparative project that has brought together a really great team of scholars from many different institutions in Latin America, United States, and Europe. I should mention that this project is supported by LASA and the Ford Foundation. We are expecting that the papers that will be presented today and during the next two sessions will be revised in the light of the comments and criticisms made by the discussants. And then we expect to submit the whole manuscript for publication as an edited collection. As a member of the faculty of the Institute of Political Science at the University of Brasilia, and also as Deputy Director of Graduate Studies, I'd like to say warm welcome to all of you. For everybody who has not yet heard of the Institute of Political Science, we are among the top graduate programs in Brazil, according to the National Evaluation Agency, CAPES. And according to the Shanghai ranking, we are among the top 5 political science departments in Latin America. So it is a pleasure for us to have all of you here today. Today's session will be chaired by my friend, Ryan Lloyd from the University of Texas at Austin. He will taking care of time. We'll have 4 presentations today, and we have 3 discussants. He will come up with the details briefly. I should also mention that Ryan Lloyd is not only a member of our research group, but he is also my co-editor. He's helping me to organize this book on the new right in Latin America. Finally, before we start the event, I would like to say thanks to our discussants, Juan Pablo Luna, Jana Morgan, and James Loxton, who have kindly accepted to contribute to this project. And I would also like to thank our administrative assistant, Carla Moura, and our graduate students, Amanda Vitória, Amanda Barcelos, and Barbara Maia, who have made a really great job of spreading the word about the workshop. So I'll finish here, and then I will allow the director of the Institute of Political Science, Danusa, to say a few brief words. Thanks.
Hello, good evening for everybody. I'm Danusa, I'm the director of EPOL, and I would like to welcome everyone who will participate in the 3-day workshop on the politics of the new right in Latin America. I always say this, but I think it's very important. We have been working for 17 months now under difficult conditions, and it's always necessary to say that Brazil concentrates a lot of new cases and unfortunately thousands of deaths registered by COVID-19. Today in Brazil we reached 57,000 registered deaths by COVID-19. And I am very sorry for the losses we have all suffered along these horrible times and months. Despite this dire situation, our colleagues are working a lot, tirelessly, but well, we are all tired, but tirelessly, to make good science in these difficult times. So I thank Professor André Borges, my colleague here at EPOL, and Professor Ryan Lloyd for organizing this event. And thank you for being here, everybody who's participating and everybody who's watching this event. And I wish good work for everybody in this workshop. Thank you, André.
Okay. Okay, so now I think I will just allow Ryan Lloyd to officially start the event. Ryan?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Andre, for the introduction, and thank you so much as well, Danusa. So the way we're going to do this here is we're going to start with our presentations, and we're going to aim for about 12 minutes on the presentations, and then we're going to give 15 minutes to each discussant. And then after that, we will take questions from the audience if we have time, but we have to get out of here by about 7 p.m. Central Time. So that would be in about an hour and 53 minutes. So we will try to make sure that everything runs smoothly so we can take all of your lovely questions. So I'll just go ahead and give everyone a quick introduction so you'll know where everyone is in the running order. And then we'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to first start with conservative decay and reaction after the left turn, accounting for the divergent trajectories of the Latin American right. And that's by André Borges from the University of Brasilia, me, and Lucio Hanau. We'll then go to competitive new right parties in Latin America in adverse times, Argentina's Republican Proposal and Comparative Perspective by Gabriel Vomaro from UNSAM. And those two papers will be commented on by our discussant Juan Pablo Luna from PUC Chile. We'll then have our third paper, Brazilian Parties in the 21st Century, the New Rights Constitutional Agenda by Gabriela Tarocco from the Universidade Federal de Pernambuco. And that'll be commented on by Jana Morgan from the University of Tennessee. And our last paper will be How to Convert a Populist Heritage into a Pro-Establishment Right-Wing Party, the Resilience of Fujimorismo in the Electoral Arena. And that will be by Carlos Melendez from the Universidad Diego Portales. And that'll be commented on by James Lockton from the University of Sydney. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to André for our first presentation. And André, you have 12 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so just a second. I will share a presentation. Just a second. Okay, so in this paper, we discuss the divergent trajectories of the Latin American right after the left turn. So this presentation is organized in theory, hypothesis, data, descriptive results, methods, results, and discussion. So I would just move on right away to the result problem. The paper, basically what we are trying to do is trying to understand variation in the electoral fortunes of the political right, and especially considering the electoral challenges brought about by the left turn. And basically the idea here is this, to the extent that right-wing parties had historically aligned with the preservation of social hierarchies, the electoral landscape looked rather inhospitable to conservatives, where leftist incumbents had succeeded in implementing redistributive social policies. And I think it's important to say something briefly about how we define the political right. Basically, we follow the definition by Juan Pablo Luna and Cristóbal Rovira Kaltwasser. Well, and they say that they are following Bobbio when they say that left and right differ mainly in what concerns the understanding of the state's role in fighting social inequality and modifying existing social hierarchies. Another thing is that the political right tends to prioritize other goals like economic efficiency to the detriment of fighting inequality. So a thin conception of social justice. In highly unequal societies, therefore, if party competition were organized around the left-right economic axis, we would expect right-wing parties to be always in disadvantage relatively to leftist alternatives. And so this is a bit of our of the context. I mean, where we are departing from. The idea that the left turn in Latin America, in a sense, represented a challenge to traditional right-wing parties, you know, because these leftist incumbents, they try to politicize inequality. So I will just move on to our hypotheses. First, we argue that in those countries where there existed no consolidated conservative parties, right-wing forces, they had to rely on non-partisan, non-electoral strategies like mass protests, or they had to rely on party-building activities, which are costly and long-term activities. So we expect that where the political right was organized within strong parties, adaptation to changing competitive environments was easier. So this leads us to our first hypothesis. The electoral performance of the right-wing bloc should be substantially better in contexts characterized by higher levels of conservative party institutionalization. Well, our second hypothesis, it has to do with distinct types of leftist government. And here we rely on the literature on the left turn in Latin America. And then we make a distinction between the contestatory and the moderate left in Latin America. Basically, the idea that in some countries like Venezuela, you had radical, populist, leftist governments, whereas in other countries like Brazil. Okay, just a second. Well, for some reason, I think my slides are not changing. Yeah, okay, guys, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I'll just try to share again, okay? Can you see now? Ryan, can you tell me whether you can see my the current slide? Okay, so yeah, I think now we can see the slide. So sorry about that, guys. Sorry about this technical issue. So basically, we argue that there are two types of leftist government, and then we assume that in the presence of populist, contestatory leftist governments, the political right had faced a double challenge, which was not only to mount a feasible alternative to the incumbent government, but also to fight against democratic erosion. So right-wing parties were less likely to survive and remain competitive in national elections when the contestatory left was the incumbent government. So moving to our last hypothesis, we believe that the success of the political right depended on conservatives' ability to politicize non-economic issues, and cleavages. So in here is the idea that conservative parties, they may campaign on issues which are orthogonal to left-right economic conflicts such as crime, religious values, or they can politicize ethnic, territorial, or religious identities to more easily build multi-class electoral coalitions. And so our last hypothesis is that right-wing parties should perform better in elections when economic issues and cleavages that cross-cut social class became more politicized. So here are our hypotheses. I will not repeat them. Okay. And then our data, we built a data set covering 16 countries from the 1980s up to the late 2010s. Electoral data was obtained from the political database of the Americas, the Parline database, and then we used various measures of parties' ideologies and issue positions from the V Party 2020. Okay. So our models have some control variables, GDP per capita, average years of schooling. We also have a measure from Latino Barometro, which is the ideological self-placement of voters. And finally, a control for the percentage of Protestant voters. So this graph shows variation in this the performance of the right-wing bloc in Latin America. So we see some cases like Bolivia, for instance, where there was a sharp decrease in the electoral strength of the right, contrasting with cases like Colombia, for instance, where you see like the opposite trend. In cases like Brazil and Chile, where you see substantial stability, well, there is some variation over time, but we see that right-wing parties obtain large shares, and this is maintained over time. So our models, they try to explain this variation that is shown in the graph. This other graph shows our measure, which is the saliency of the liberal-conservative divide. I would, due to time issues, I would just move forward. These are our regression results. Our dependent variable is the vote share of right-wing parties, okay? And so we can see here the variables in red are the variables that are connected to our hypothesis. And then we can see here that we find results that are consistent with the hypothesis. This measure of the liberal-conservative divide saliency, it has a positive effect. Contestatory left, a negative effect. That's what we expected when you have contestatory left governments to see worse results. And conservative party institutionalization also has a positive effect. So basically, the political right performs better in national elections when conservative parties are highly institutionalized and where non-economic issues are more salient. But we find some differences across models, somewhat weaker effects in the mixed effects as opposed to the GE models. We find the strongest support for our second hypothesis, which concerns the type of leftist government. That is, our measure of contestatory left government has a very large negative effect on the right-wing bloc's vote. And so that's it. Thank you. Gracias. Obrigado.
All right. Thanks so much, Andre. And thank you as well for the excellent timekeeping. We'll go ahead now to our next presentation, which is Gabriel Vomaro. So, Gabriel, the show is yours.
Thanks, Ryan. So, share. Okay. Well, I will present in Spanish. So my presentation's title is competitive new right-wing parties in Latin America in at the first time. Mi argumento parte de la base de que en América Latina, en el post-neoliberalismo, en el contexto post-neoliberal, emergieron nuevos partidos de derecha competitivos, como PRO en Argentina, Centro Democrático en Colombia y potencialmente, creo, en Ecuador. Mi caso principal es PRO, que es un caso sorprendente en términos de la debilidad histórica de la derecha partidaria en Argentina, y es un caso normativamente bienvenido, de acuerdo con la tesis clásica de Ditela respecto de la idea de que hacía falta un partido de derecha competitivo para la estabilidad de la democracia. Sin embargo, de acuerdo, digamos, estos casos no pueden ser explicados por las teorías disponibles, que explican algunos otros casos de derechas exitosas, la teoría de los partidos basados en corporaciones de Barnt y la teoría sobre los partidos sucesores autoritarios de James Loxton, que está aquí entre nosotros, que explican muy bien otros casos, pero que no sirven para explicar estos casos que son los que tomo yo, que son partidos nacidos durante el giro a la izquierda o durante el contexto post-neoliberal. Entonces, mi esquema intenta justamente llenar este vacío relativo con un modelo adaptado al contexto histórico. Mi argumento es que estos nuevos partidos de derecha son exitosos en un contexto, digamos, cuando en primer lugar realizan una innovación programática. Ahora vamos a ver qué significa esto. En segundo lugar, desarrollan mecanismos de mediación organizativos, tanto con su core constituency como con electorados secundarios. Y por último, explotan estratégicamente una suerte de pánico moral que en el contexto postneoliberal se da en particular en torno al modelo Venezuela, o a la chavización, o al castrochavismo, o a Chilezuela, o lo que sea en cada caso. Y en segundo lugar, en relación a las transformaciones culturales o de las normas culturales en los países de la región. Este esquema entonces intenta explicar el surgimiento de las derechas partidarias competitivas en un contexto específico, que es justamente el contexto del giro a la izquierda, del crecimiento de la polarización política y de los consensos extendidos en torno a cuestiones redistributivas, por un lado, y una agenda cultural progresista que abarca inclusive a fuerzas de centro-derecha mainstream o moderadas. Tiene también la pretensión de incorporar una dimensión de estudios culturales que tiene que ver con incorporar el rol clave que parecen jugar en la movilización partidaria de las derechas, incentivos morales vinculados con el temor y que han sido demostrados por buena parte de las teorías que estudian los incentivos para la movilización de las bases sociales conservadoras. Lo que propongo para entender qué es un partido de derecha competitivo, un nuevo partido de derecha competitivo, en mis términos, la definición tiene que ver básicamente con una definición más a la Gibson, sociológica, que tiene que ver con que tienen su core constituency en las clases altas y medias altas y en el mundo de los negocios, y en términos históricos que fueron, digamos, que tuvieron lugar, cuyo origen tiene lugar en la tercera ola, o luego de la tercera ola, digamos, durante o después de la tercera ola. asumo que partidos de derecha anteriores que logran ser competitivos tuvieron otros desafíos que no tienen que ver con lo que yo estudio sobre las nuevas fuerzas de derecha, y por tanto no los incluyo en mi esquema de definición. La definición es una definición fuertemente contextualizada, que se basa en un set de atributos más que en un determinada métrica. Digamos, no hay métrica en mi definición, podemos después discutir por qué tomé esta decisión. Y básicamente hay 3 atributos que hacen a la competitividad de un partido de derecha. La primera tiene que ver con que tengan un arraigo subnacional, una raíz subnacional en algún distrito relevante, que sea su bastión y que funcione justamente como ese espacio de, digamos, del cual nacen muchas veces los partidos, pero sobre todo un espacio de repliegue y de retroalimentación del partido, inclusive en contextos de derrota o de crisis. En segundo lugar, que sea capaz de tener liderazgos más allá de su líder fundador y más allá de su líder principal, que tenga presencia en los medios a través de otros líderes, de otros políticos ambiciosos que funcionen también como indicador de la construcción de un partido que trasciende un vehículo personalista. Y en tercer lugar, que su ascenso tenga cierta independencia de crisis externas, tanto en lo económico como en crisis políticas. Con esto también quiero evitar incorporar en la definición grupos políticos, vehículos políticos que aprovechan la oportunidad, por así decirlo, de una crisis económica o política, de una crisis institucional como hubo en otros países de la región, para hacerse con el poder o para cobrar relevancia en la arena política nacional. Pro claramente cumple los 3 atributos porque es un partido que tiene su bastión en la ciudad de Buenos Aires, que gobierna desde el año 2007 y en la que gana elecciones desde el año 2005. Tiene sin duda liderazgos visibles más allá de su líder fundador, que es Macri, que es un empresario, y de hecho ahora está viviendo un proceso de transformación luego de la pérdida de relevancia de su líder fundador, y aparecen esos líderes de recambio. Y claramente su construcción como partido competitivo no fue dependiente de una crisis externa ni en lo económico, digamos, ni en lo político, aunque por supuesto fue favorecida por las dificultades económicas que tuvo el gobierno peronista de centro-izquierda en el contexto de la crisis del final del boom de las materias primarias. Mi esquema parte de la base que hay 2 tipos de obstáculos para la formación de partidos de derecha competitivos. Uno es conocido por los trabajos ya clásicos a los que se suma, digo, el de Gibson, a los que se suma más recientemente el de Luna y el de Loxton, que muestran que las derechas tienen el gran problema de tener electorados naturales o más cercanos, núcleo, pequeños, y por tanto tienen que necesariamente atraer electorados más amplios para volverse electoralmente competitivos. Entonces hay un problema de construcción de coaliciones electorales que es clave. Pero hay un segundo obstáculo histórico, que es el que tiene que ver con la crisis del neoliberalismo y el consenso, neoliberal, que es la de los partidos que nacen en un contexto normativo, en lo cultural desfavorable, y en un contexto de consensos económicos distributivos también desfavorables, y tienen, por tanto, que lidiar con eso para poder mantener su relevancia en la arena política nacional, o para crecer y para volverse partidos competitivos en ese contexto. Voy a pasar rápido esto, que era un poco lo que ya dije sobre las explicaciones. Mi modelo tiene básicamente, entonces, digamos, el objetivo de explicar este nacimiento de algunos partidos de derecha en contextos adversos. Y la cuestión de la competitividad y sus desafíos me hacen enfocarme en dos tipos de recursos, los organizativos y los ideacionales. Digamos, estos recursos están incorporados en los modelos alternativos que explican, como yo decía recién, otros casos, pero están desplegados, adaptados a las realidades empíricas que esos casos digamos, manifiestan, y por tanto yo los tomo como formas empíricas, históricas específicas de tipos de recursos, digamos, teóricamente organizables en esta idea de lo organizativo y lo ideacional, y es en esas dos divisiones en las que baso mi modelo, a lo cual le sumo una tercera cuestión que, digamos, me parece, digamos, que ordena el modelo, que es el rol de los liderazgos partidarios en el uso estratégico de estos recursos y en su capacidad y en su competencia para hacerlo de un modo exitoso, tanto en lo que tiene que ver con la renovación programática como con la apuesta por construir mediaciones organizativas del partido con sus electorados núcleo y secundarios. Entonces, digamos, repito, los tres factores fundamentales. Uno tiene que ver con lo que tiene que ver con construir mediaciones organizativas que permitan que sus partidos se conecten con su electorado núcleo, y en segundo lugar que puedan incorporar electorados secundarios. Esto en el caso de PRO, para sumar alguna cuestión más de tipo empírico, digamos, el caso de PRO lo incorporó esto segundo con el reclutamiento de líderes políticos de los partidos tradicionales que trajeron en parte sus clientelas. La innovación programática tiene que ver básicamente con cómo los partidos de derecha logran incorporar, digamos, adaptarse a la agenda cultural y económica progresiva de los años del giro a la izquierda, o bien proponer un clivaje alternativo que les permita hacer pie, que puede ser la seguridad o puede ser cuestiones que tienen que ver con la resolución de problemas concretos. Y el tercer factor, digamos, tiene que ver justamente con la idea de cómo hacer para que el miedo asociado, por un lado, a la posible chavización como una deriva autoritaria y a la vez anticapitalista de los países, y a la vez la cuestión de la reacción cultural a los cambios de normas, se vuelvan incentivos para el apoyo de los partidos nuevos. Bueno, los casos que tomo son el caso de PRO como caso principal, como les decía recién. Luego testeo la aplicabilidad básicamente de mi modelo a un segundo caso de partido competitivo, que es el Centro Democrático en Colombia. Luego tomo como caso negativo el principal partido regional en Bolivia, el Partido Socialdemócrata, que es el partido que intentó más seriamente construir un partido nacional competitivo, pero que falló sistemáticamente. Y luego uso también el modelo para explicar casos de partidos que provenían de sus raíces autoritarias, pero que no obstante logran ser más competitivos en el contexto del giro a la izquierda, y muestro, digamos, los factores que explican, contribuyen, son complementarios, explicar el éxito de partidos en el contexto del giro a la izquierda. Un poco el cuadro de los casos y de los paso rápido con esto porque ya creo que quedó claro. Y para concluir, básicamente con algunas cuestiones más de tipo lo digamos claramente los nuevos partidos competitivos de derecha es una respecto de su lado para la estabilidad, tienen por un lado capacidad de movilización, de incorporación, inclusive de crear un canal de representación para derechas competitivas cuando no lo había, como Argentina, pero al mismo tiempo tienen un fuerte componente de reaccionario, que cuando los lleva al poder les dificulta bastante la incorporación de demandas, digamos, más desde abajo, y el poder lidiar con la movilización social que es rápidamente asimilada a esas amenazas que dieron incentivo para el ascenso de esas nuevas derechas. Aquí termino y les agradezco por su atención.
Yep, I was just on mute, wasn't I? So thanks, first of all, thanks so much, Gabriel. And yeah, so our next presentation will be Gabriela Tarocco. So go ahead, the floor is yours, Gabriela.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Andre, for inviting me and for organizing everything. Let me share my... Okay. Can you see my slides, right? Well, so this paper, this chapter is about the new right, constitutional agenda, and the new political parties on the right wing in Brazil. My research question is if the new Brazilian political parties on the right are able to supply a new right agenda, a new right demand for constitutional change in Brazil. So to try to answer that, I use data from proposals of constitutional amendments, you call PECs, Propostas de Emenda Constitucional, and we had almost 4,000 proposals of constitutional amendments, a lot of PECs since the constitution from 1988 until last year, 2020. And these data are available in the website from the Chamber of Deputies. So I assume that there is demand for constitutional amendments, a conservative demand. I assume that there is a new right agenda in Brazil that is different from the traditional right, because they emphasize values and behavior and law and order, and they fight progressist policies. So I rely on this literature on the new right, and I assume there is this new right politics and in Brazil, and that they have a constitutional agenda. And I am searching for the supply side, and so I search for this in the contents of these specs, these proposals of amendments from 2001 to 2020. Only that specs presented by federal deputies, and I assume that some articles in the Constitution are able to reflect some new right agenda, new right topics, new rights subjects. So that articles on fundamental principles, rights and duties, justice, security and family, for example, they were addressed in many proposals. And here we can think on the proposals of amendment as the unity of analysis, or the articles as unit of analysis, because each pack, each proposal may contain more than one, many times several articles. So each pack can change more than one article in the Constitution. So when I take the articles as the unit of analysis, I can see 431 times among the packs that this kind of issues, this kind of topics were addressed in packs in Brazil, in the proposals of amendment. So the new right, I call them the new right articles, and this is a little bit arbitrary, but maybe I can show this in this table. There are some articles on fundamental principles, on rights and duties, justice, the state of defense, armed forces, public security, family, child, indigenous people. And these kind of subjects are in these specific articles in the Constitution, and each kind of subject was addressed many times in the whole set of proposals. And there are so 24 articles that I call new right articles. And now I want to see who or which parties addressed these articles in their proposals. First, let me show this dynamics of this kind of constitutional agenda. Here we can see how from 2001 to 2020 that the proportion of this kind of articles, these new right articles, out of the proposals, how they relate with the other subjects in the packs. So we can see that in the beginning of this period, we had more packs addressing this kind of articles, and in the last years, this proportion is decreasing. Well, I would ask if this new right agenda is supported by new right parties in Brazil. But the new right-wing Brazilian political parties are these ones that you can see. And so there are other right-wing parties that seem new parties because they changed their names. Many political parties changed their names, but they are not new. The new ones are these 7 political parties from 2011 until 2015. And they are not the authors, the authors of that packs on new rights subjects. Among these articles, and how many times each of these articles was addressed in these proposals, these new right parties, these new 6 right parties, they addressed in 7% of the time, but the old right parties in more than 50% of time. So I would say that this new agenda, this new right constitutional agenda, are not addressed by the new right parties, but it is addressed by the old right parties and the other parties. And here you can see how the ideology of these parties measured by the Brazilian Legislative Survey from left to right, mostly about the economic criteria for left and right, and how these parties locate in this dimension, this ideological dimension, and the proportion of proposals that which address these new right articles, these new right topics. So in the vertical axis, in the y-axis, we can see the percentage of PECs addressing that new rights topics, and each point is a party in a year. So these 4 points in the upper right corner, these 4 parties are, 2 of them are old right parties, 2 of them are new right parties. In specific years, they emphasize the new right articles in the constitutions, the new rights topics, in 100%. In this year, for example, the Solidariedade in 2013, all of their PECs were about these articles in the constitution, this set of articles. And so we can see that are many political parties from left and from right, new and old political parties addressing kind of 50% of this in these PECs, addressing 50% of these PECs about the new rights topics, or new rights agenda. So I would say that the new rights parties are not supplying the new right agenda, and the new right agenda find other parties in Brazil, mostly old right parties, like these ones. And maybe this can be an evidence to show how the old parties are now able to openly defend conservative agendas. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Gabriela. We'll now go to Carlos Melendez for our last presentation.
Please let me know if, do you see the PowerPoint? Is it okay? Not yet. Okay. Now, can you see the PowerPoint? Yeah, perfect. Okay, I go back to the presentation mode. Okay, thank you so much for organizing this this panel. I want to present this very first version of this paper about how to convert a populist heritage into a pro-establishment right-wing party. This is the case of Fujimorismo in Peru. In 2021, general elections in Peru produced a hyper-fragmented, polarized scenario. Among 18 presidential candidates, 9 of them had chances to classify to the ballotage 1 week before first round election day. None of them obtained more than 20% of the valid vote. Based on the nationally representative survey, we can position voters of the main presidential candidates based on the 1 to 10 left to right ideological self-perception scale, and 1 to 10 conservative liberal index, compounded by some questions regarding abortion, same-sex marriage, and others. We have 5 relatively competitive candidates belong to the rightist camp of the electorate. And these are the coordinates of the median voter, the Peruvian median voter, 5.9 in the left to right scale, and 3.9 in the conservative liberal axis. And so, as you can see, Keiko Fujimori's voter is closest to the median voter. In the case, is the closest from these 5 right-wing candidates. Rafael Lopez Aliaga's voter, Opus Dei businessman, had the most radical right-wing conservative voter, and Hernando de Soto's voter as the right-wing liberal voter among this right-wing camp. So as you can see, Peru, a hostile soil for party building, is also a friendly ground for the right, but a right made of diverse tastes. In the last 10 years, the right in Peru used to be divided into 2 projects, okay? A populist conservative right embodied in Fuerza Popular, the Fujimorista party, and a technocrat and liberal right embodied in Peruanos por el Cambio, the electoral vehicle of Pedro Pablo Kuczynski. Both rights had a common origin in the neoliberal reforms during the authoritarian period of Fujimori in the 90s. They used to be very competitive, as you can see in the previous 2 elections. They used to concentrate around 40 to 60% of the electoral preferences. But once in power in the previous election in 2016, Peruanos por el Cambio in executive and Fuerza Popular in the legislative, these 2 rights ended up destroying each other, actually. Corruption scandals, presidential resignations, dissolution of Congress ended up discrediting both political forces. So for 2021 elections, new political projects try to capitalize the discredit of these 2 rights, as you can see here. But, however, Fuerza Popular resisted. So why is that? Fuerza Popular has been the most enduring effort of party building in the last 2 decades in Peru. However, it might not qualify as a successful party building case because according to definition, Levitsky et al., James also collaborates to this conceptualization. A successful party building needs 2 conditions: at least 10% of the vote in 5 or more consecutive national legislative elections, and it should survive the retreat of its founding leader. So Fuerza Popular strictly does not meet this criteria, although Peruvians have voted for Fujimoristas in the 90s. Actually, Fuerza Popular did not meet this criteria, but we can sustain that at least it's an electorally successful political movement, but not an institutionalized political party. Okay, but how can we understand the case of Fuerza Popular? So my point is that parties are not made only of organization, but of followers. And Fujimorismo has been relatively successful because they have crafted a nascent partisanship, okay? Alberto Fujimori did not invest on party building when he was in power, but produced the raw materials for that. Positive evaluation of his administration, personalistic appeals, a political narrative about his legacy and anti-establishment discourse. But crafting partisanship, but he didn't invest on partisanship. As you can see, we have here the self-perception, the party ID of Peruvians during the 90s. And as you can see, most of Peruvians identify themselves as independientes, not as the followers of Cambio 90, okay? But as you know, crafting a partisanship is a difficult long-term task that needs political agency. So Keiko Fujimori, she inherited her father's political legacy. She tried to institutionalize a Fujimorista party. So she first consciously elaborated an ideological platform, socially conservative, authoritarian in social values, and pro-establishment. But and this is important because the anti-establishment component in the narrative of Fujimorist elites was still valid when Keiko Fujimori took the leadership of the movement around 2006. But probably the most important legacy of her father's administration is the most valuable asset for the current establishment, the economic chapter of 1993 Constitution. As a consequence, she tried to articulate a socially conservative, pro-establishment ideology to conquer the hearts and minds of the Peruvian electorate. So she tried to link the Fujimorista followers with that ideological articulation, and this ideological articulation served as the glue that hardcore Fujimoristas followers share. These are the measurements of hardcore Fujimoristas, leaners Fujimoristas, and anti-Fujimoristas based on an original measurement of intended electoral preferences for public office. Core Fujimoristas, as you can see, have been around 9% of the electorate. Leaners have decreased from the 22% to 10% in the last two elections. And as you can see, well, anti-Fujimoristas are the larger party ID, negative party ID in this case, in the Peruvian landscape. But what are Fujimoristas at the individual level made of? So due to previous research, we have some idea about the components of Fujimoristas at the individual level. Core Fujimoristas share some sociodemographics patterns. They tend to be women, hardcore Fujimoristas, low income and less educated in comparison to the rest of the population. But ideologically, I am working with two data sets of two nationally representative surveys conducted in 2019 in the left and 2021, 2 weeks before election, first round election day. This is the 1 to 10 right-wing self-perception scale. And as you can see, we can confirm that core Fujimoristas, okay, are they tend to position themselves in the right-wing camp, which is notoriously different from core Fujimoristas with anti-Fujimoristas, and also between core Fujimoristas and leaners. Okay, so but this is probably not it's not a surprise because we all know that Fujimoristas, especially those hardcore followers, tend to identify themselves in the right camp of the ideological continuum. But what is new, which is new, is that several studies portray the first phase of Fujimorismo as neo-populist or as a populist movement. But in the study of the demand of populism, we have learned that there are connections between populist appeals and anti-establishment identifications. People that score higher in the populist index tend to develop an anti-establishment political identities. So I applied the populist index in two nationally representative surveys in Peru, those that I've already mentioned. And the national average in Peru has been around 3.9 in this 1 to 5 scale. In 5 is the highest populist measure. And surprisingly, core Fujimoristas score below the national media in 2019 and almost below the national media in 2021. Even the Fujimoristas leaners ranked below the national mean. So probably this is the first evidence about that Fujimorista at the individual level tend to qualify as the defenders of the establishment. People below this media tend to reject populist appeals, tend to create appeals in favor of the political establishment. So the Fujimoristas that once used to be an anti-establishment identifiers, now they are the defenders of the establishment. So as a preliminary conclusions, we can say that Fuerza Popular has promoted a strategy of party building based on crafting nascent partisanship, okay? But the second generation leaders have kept a right-wing self-perception among their followers. But at the individual level, Fujimoristas have shifted from anti-establishment identifiers to pro-establishment defenders, despite the fact that they haven't been in power in the last years. So crafting partisanship is so far successful strategy that has rented electoral benefits for Fujimoristas and has the potential for effective party building. And also we can see that the development of this identification has preceded the formation of a formal organization, which is a major challenge, especially for the Peruvian landscape. So this is the pending questions that I am working on for the next version of this paper, is crafting partisanship a promising strategy for party building in societies with weak intermediate organizations, low interpersonal trust, and feeble social capital, like the case of Peru. Thank you for that.
Again, thanks so much, Carlos. We'll now go to Juan Pablo Luna with comments on our first two papers. And so, yeah, you can go ahead, Juan Pablo.
Okay, thanks very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to read and comment in these papers. I'll go in order, and I have some collective comments I'll try to make at the end. Regarding the Borges, Lloyd, and Renault paper, I think it makes sense, right? I mean, your three hypotheses and the results you get tend to make sense, and I don't have much of a quarrel with them. But I want to introduce some complications that might be useful for thinking out how to expand and improve the paper. First, you have this argument about in a context or while competing with a moderate left, and in the context of more institutionalized party systems, leads to better performances of rightist parties. This is a similar argument that the one that was made before about the left and the social democratic left and the impact of institutionalized party systems in kind of moderating and at the same time helping to entrench better or better entrenched parties from the left. And I'm thinking about Lanzaro, Flores Macias, Levitsky and Roberts, etc. So I think that you're making here the parallel argument, and it tends to make sense, and it goes with the literature. But at the same time, I have questions regarding the alternative scenario, in which you have a contestatory left, a more radical left, and in which you don't see a well-entrenched and electorally successful rights party coming along. And the main question I have here is asymmetric causation, right? I mean, what explains why you develop a better organized right and more successful right might not be the same as the opposite that explains why you don't have it, right? And in that regard, I think, and obviously your model and your empirical model, it's modeling this as symmetric causation, whereas it might be asymmetric. And what I'm thinking about here has to do with, in a contestatory left scenario, you have an incumbent that tends to be hegemonic, in some cases, in a context of competitive authoritarianism, or with conditions that make rightist organizational efforts more difficult to come along. But the explanation, I mean, there has to do with regime and has to do with the context, not especially with what the right does, which is what you prime in your hypothesis. At the same time, and I said I could say some things about the two papers and how they come along together at the end, but I take the opportunity to do it now. I was wondering, Bomaro's paper has this idea about the Venezuelan scare, right? And it's interesting because it works for cases that are not Venezuela, but it doesn't seem to work for the cases that have that type of leftist incumbent. So it's kind of more a contagion or a fear of contagion rather than something that happens in the systems that have that type of leadership. So you can reconcile the two findings there. When I and this is also something that I think applies to both papers. When I read these papers, I see all the time linear arguments about the conditions that make rightist parties prosper or not. And I keep thinking that it might well be the case that what you have here is curvilinear types of non-linear causal relationships, right? So for a rightist party to develop, you need to be in a situation in which you don't have a leftist party that is too weak, but also you should avoid having a leftist party that is too strong, right? So it's in this hotspot, right, or sweet spot in which it's more curvilinear than linear in my view, in which you have enough incentives to mobilize, but at the same time, and to organize, but at the same time, your opponent, it's not too strong to be deterring that organization. So I wonder whether your models can accommodate kind of a more non-linear pattern of causation there. I have some worries coming back to the Borges and Lloyd and Renault paper. I have some worries about the dynamics of your analysis. I mean, you talk in the paper about the case of El Salvador as a somewhat positive case. It's a case in which you have a very highly institutionalized party system, two very well organized parties on the left and on the right, satisfying all the conditions that people that have created conditions for seeing parties in the region. El Salvador parties have that. And suddenly, I mean, it comes to Bukele, and first he completely demolishes FMLN and then Arena in two elections. So I wonder whether your analysis can accommodate these dynamics, or are just capturing different scenarios, static scenarios that can change very rapidly in a given case, right? And do change. I mean, all these cases are kind of in turmoil, right? So I wonder whether you are not seeing more stability and structure in a context in which I don't see that much stability or structure. In terms of your the hypothesis on the importance of the non-economic issues, I completely buy that argument. I think it's right. I also think it's important to consider balance and balance competition as an important way of getting electoral traction for the right. And that makes me think about how much of the electoral inroads by the right that we are seeing are due to organizational efforts, are due to being right, or how much of that is more positional than ideological. It's being in the opposition during a time where incumbents are beginning to struggle with corruption, with economic slowdown, etc. So it's not a function of being right, it's a function of being in the opposition. On the empirics, I hate to say this, but I think it's a highly correlational model. It has all the perils of those types of models, and in addition to that, I think you rely too much on expert indicators and expert surveys, right? Having done expert surveys, no matter how well you do expert surveys, you are not. I cannot, like, in a way, it's difficult for me to swallow that what you are seeing as correlations among your variables and indicators coming from that expert survey are real correlations, or are correlations that are in the heads of people who is responding to a survey. Right? So I would do my best to have like expert survey results on one side of the equation, not on both, and to avoid overanalyzing correlations between rankings that might be a bit of in the imagination of people. The other thing about the models, and I close with this, you have GDP as a control, but I don't see anything, and I come back to this idea of positional, about the political economy and the economic dynamics, corruption scandals, as being part of your controls, and I might have not see them, but like I would rarely incorporate those into your models. Switching to the Bomaro paper, I think Gabriel is struggling with the following issue. I mean, he has a very nice explanation, and I completely buy his case about the pro. But the problem is how to make the pro travel, right? Particularly because the pro, to me, it's a very weird case, right? In Latin America, right? So it's a country that never had a conservative party, a successful conservative party in its history. Conservatives used to make politics not in the electoral realm. It grows in a context in which you have the Radical Party, who was the alternative to the Peronist, being like completely like in decomposition after 2001, and it competes against a very well entrenched Peronist party that is not only organizationally strong but also ideologically plastic, right? So you have to really think through how to, and it's a party that can be in the opposition and in government at the same time, right? So it's a very weird case and a very weird scenario in which this party develops and grows. And when I go and look at the other cases, I find trouble in doing that on two, like on two dimensions. One is how comparable are the other parties being compared to the pro, really comparable to the pro as a party and as an organization, and what's built or what's not built in the other cases. And I have some issues with some of the parties, right? And the other has to do with the causal process that you see in each case. In terms of that, in the case of Uribe, for instance, my sense is that he builds his leadership from the presidency, right? In a context in which there is no left being like electorally contesting seriously contesting the elections. My sense is that what gets built there, it's very difficult to create succession problems, right? Whoever gets there after Uribe. It's not Uribe. Uribe defects from the party. Organizationally, I don't see something like the pro there. You have all the guerrilla and the paramilitary settings there that complicate the story a lot. I obviously see in the case of Uribe and Centro Democrático the programmatic innovation, right? The democratic peace idea. It's a powerful one for Colombia, and I see that. But I don't see the other components as clearly as in the Argentinian case. In the case of Bolivia, you have a super strong territorial enclave in Costas and the MDS. It's hegemonic in La Media Luna, but I don't see much of a programmatic innovation there. What I see there, and I met these guys and interviewed these guys at some point, it's defense elites that are defending their economic prerogatives, right? And that's why when they come to an agreement with Morales, particularly under land reform, right, that thing vanishes, right? And at the same time, part of what I don't see in Bolivia is that, and this is shows how you have to have the three components, but how it's very difficult to have the three components, right? Is that in Bolivia you have huge fragmentation of opposition forces, all of them competing trying to make the second place and therefore going to the runoff with Morales, right? You had Juan del Granado in La Paz. You had a big industrial owner that at some point was mobilizing business, Samuel Doria, right? But it's all very fragmented, and they're all competing against each other to get to a second place in the runoff. So that creates a context in which it's very difficult to organize, and I don't see that in your story of why the MDS didn't develop. And finally, in the case of Chile, I think what Udi and Aren are already there. Why are you I would when I started looking at the paper, I was expecting to see something about Evópoli or Partido Republicano, right? But not about Aren and the UDI. And I think the reasons why they are there might be consistent with your argument on the pro, but it's not completely plausible that those are the only conditions that were there or the main conditions that kept them there and make them stick. Also, I mean, you have electoral institutions that protected them for much of their life as parties, right? Two more points, and I finish with this. I was wondering whether you could recall, rename the Venezuela scare as Red Scare, right? This is Red Scare. It's not novel. It wasn't invented by fear to Chavismo. And it was very prevalent in the 50s and 60s after the Cuban Revolution in Latin America. So I think you can make a broader argument about Red Scare and not about Venezuela. Perhaps there are other examples back in the time that might help you make that argument more efficiently. And I think you use the Venezuela thing a bit to kind of convenient when it is convenient to your argument. Right? I don't see that as such a strong factor as the others. At least in the other cases you try to compare the pro with. On the importance of organization, and this is the last point, I was thinking about the Brazilian Northeast, right, and how there are some arguments, for instance, by Al Monteiro, by César Suco. I guess there are other people in Brazil making this argument that the PT was able to dismantle at some point the organizational basis of the traditional right in the Brazilian Northeast. And I think that might be a case that might be useful to prove your point about the importance of organizations that you are now exploiting in this version. Thanks.
All right, thanks so much, Juan Pablo. Those are great comments. We'll now go to Jana Morgan for comments on Gabriel Taroco's paper.
Great, thanks everybody, and thanks for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to read the papers and hear the comments tonight, so thanks. So Gabriela's paper addresses how Brazilian parties use efforts to amend the constitution in order to advance new right goals. And as she presented, the empirical analysis is based on this comprehensive cataloging of proposed constitutional amendments. I think the paper has a lot of promise and the data seem really rich. So, but rather than focus all my comments on what's great about the paper, I'm gonna try to offer some comments that will help you kind of push it forward. So let me just start with some thoughts about sort of the way the paper is framed. I think you could do a lot more in the introduction to contextualize the contribution that you're making here. Oh, and Gabriela, let me just say, I have all of these comments written, so I can send you the written comments. You don't have to worry about taking notes if you don't want to. So I was kind of curious how you chose to focus on constitutional amendments as a strategy for understanding the new right agenda. So it would be nice to know kind of from the outset of the paper what the significance of these proposals are and what this particular empirical lens will enable us to understand that we might miss if we looked elsewhere. And then also just kind of how this focus enables us to understand the new right in Brazil, but also elsewhere, and about partisan agendas more broadly. All right, moving on a bit to sort of the theory and conceptual development in the paper. So in this paper, the new right is obviously a really important concept, as it is throughout the volume. And it may be that the volume itself is going to kind of in an introductory chapter or something kind of provide a comprehensive definition or conceptualization of what we mean by the right and what's the difference between the old right and the new right. But reading the paper in isolation, at least, I felt like it could do more to lay out what is meant by the new right here. It seemed to me in the discussion that there were perhaps two components that go into identifying whether a party would be classified as being quote unquote new right. One of those components was a substantive component with the new right being focused on certain kinds of policy goals or certain types of issues. But there also seemed to be a kind of time component. For example, the choice to focus only on parties that had formed since, I think, 2001. And I wondered why both of those things kind of were required for a party to be considered new right. Is it possible to have a new party that was formed since 2001 but doesn't take up these kinds of new right policy goals, and how would we classify those parties? Or could old parties of the right sort of morph into emphasizing these new right issues and then kind of take on the mantle of new right parties? So all of that kind of conceptual development was a little bit murky to me. And so I think it would be really helpful to just directly answer the question, how do we define and categorize parties as new right? And then relatedly, I was curious how certain issues came to be classified as new right issues. So if part of the definition of the new right has to do with the types of policies or issues that they champion, then it would be important to clarify exactly what that dimension looks like. So the paper talks about how the sort of new right maps onto a different dimension than the traditional left-right axis. And if that's the case, then what sort of issues map on to the traditional left-right axis, and what types of issues map onto some kind of alternative dimension that's emphasized by the new right? And then that also raised the question for me is there a new left? And where do they fall on this alternative dimension that it sort of locates where the new right is situated? So just differentiating between the traditional left-right and what you mean by the new right, and what that axis looks like, what are the kind of endpoints on that axis, would be helpful in clarifying the paper's argument. In addition to these sort of conceptual clarifications, I thought the paper could benefit from some discussion of how different empirical patterns of constitutional amendment proposals might offer theoretical insight. So before diving into the paper, I think it could be really helpful for you to have a discussion about the kinds of patterns that we might expect under different views or understandings of what constitutes the new right. So if we see pattern A, it means this, and if we see pattern B, it means that. I think that would just help provide a sort of theoretical map on which to sort of position the empirical analysis that comes later in the paper. And I think engaging with sort of a broader literature about the importance and use of constitutional reform as a political or policy tool used by Brazilian parties or by parties elsewhere could also kind of help to situate the argument. So I was especially interested in the party's claim and finding that parties across the party system are pursuing what are classified as new right goals. And was wondering why they do this. And if they are doing it, which is a point that I'm going to return to in a minute, because I'm not totally sure that they are, but if they are doing it, what does this tell us about the nature of new right issues and the parties that are built on these ideas, if they're so flexible that they can just be pursued by all kinds of parties across the party system? And then just another kind of bigger conceptual question is I found myself asking as I read the paper about what is the relationship between the new right and between populism, and do they overlap? Do they overlap partly, entirely? So I felt like populism wasn't really talked about in the paper, but it seemed like a potentially relevant concept for situating what you mean by the new right. All right, turning to the empirics. So I would really like to have more information in the paper about the significance and role of constitutional amendment proposals in the Brazilian political system. So we're just given these data about all these constitutional amendment proposals, and at least for me, who's not a Brazil specialist, I was like, what does this mean? This seems like a lot of constitutional amendment proposals, but maybe that's normal. I don't study constitutional amendment proposals either. So I thought, well, maybe there's just a lot of constitutional amendment proposals going on out there that I don't know about. So I would have liked more information about why there are so many. How did the constitutional amendment proposals compare in their quantity to, say, the number of laws proposed each year? And how does Brazilian constitutional activity compare to other countries across Latin America? So I just was really wanting some of this information to be situated so I could kind of make better sense of it. And I was also curious, I looked and I'm not sure I definitely couldn't find, maybe it was there and I didn't see it, what percentage of these proposals are actually successful. So they're making, all of these constitutional amendment proposals, but how many are actually successful in changing the Constitution? Are they just political signaling, or do they actually really think that these proposals are going to be successful? So I was just wondering kind of about their role in the political process. Also, in terms of the specific types of proposed amendments, I thought a little more background info would be helpful. For instance, I wondered why so many proposals focused on organizational features contained in the Constitution and less on the substantive policy areas. Perhaps this is just the nature of constitutional reform, but then one wonders why politicians are directing their effort toward this sort of organizational change rather than more substantive policy proposals. So on both these points about the meaning of the data, just some concrete examples would also really be helpful. There's one in the paper's introduction, but it'd be really nice to provide some examples of different types of constitutional amendment proposals to illustrate some of the arguments throughout the text, just to add some, I think it would help clarify some of the patterns that we see if we had examples. Okay, and then that's sort of like, what are the data? What do they mean? Now thinking about the actual analysis of the data, a central part of the empirical analysis in the paper is found in Table 4 and Figure 1, and you showed at least Figure 1 in the presentation today. And there we see information about how much attention different parties across the Brazilian party system give to proposals that are aiming to amend sections of the Constitution that have to do with the new right. So these different sections are specified in Table 3, but I wasn't exactly clear how they came to be identified as new right areas. What was the universe of possible new right issues that could fall into this category? And how did you decide exactly that a particular section of the Constitution addressed one of these issue areas? Relatedly then, and this is returning to the point I alluded to earlier, the paper then goes on to argue that parties across the ideological spectrum make amendment proposals that aim to advance new right issues, because all kinds of parties are making proposals that aim to change the sections of the Constitution that are identified as dealing with new right issues. And here I became a little bit confused because it wasn't clear to me if the directionality of the proposed amendment was coded, or if it was just whether the amendment dealt with a particular portion of the Constitution. I think it was the latter. And so if that's the case, then amendments are coded as having to do with the new right if they address portions of the Constitution that deal with new right issues. But this coding approach would treat a proposal that aimed to actually kind of move in the opposite direction of a new right issue, the same as it would code an amendment proposal that aimed to move in favor of a new right issue. So let me give you an example. A proposal that aimed to restrict Indigenous rights, an issue that I think the paper would see as a new right issue, would be coded exactly the same as an amendment proposal that aimed to expand Indigenous rights, while in reality, they're actually doing totally opposite things. And so I think it would be important, and perhaps this is happening and I just didn't catch it in the paper, but I think it would be important to code the amendment proposals, not just in terms of which part of the Constitution they're addressing, but the actual content of that proposal and whether it's actually advancing a new right issue or trying to kind of move against the sorts of policies that the new right would like to advance. So these proposals aren't all the same. And so I would want to be convinced that these parties on the left and center that are making amendment proposals that have to do with new right sections of the Constitution are actually advancing new right issues. And then just sort of a small point I want to return to regarding the overall volume. As I already mentioned, one question that arose for me as I read this paper was a conceptual one concerning how the right is defined and how the new right is different from the old right, not just having to do with the age of parties, but also in terms of issues. And so I think these are types of things that the overall volume might want to grapple with, even if individual authors and their chapters maybe depart from the conceptual framework that the volume develops, that would then be clear to everyone reading the whole volume. So I think the whole project is really great, and I'm really excited to see how this chapter and all of the others that are part of the volume continue to evolve. Thanks for the invitation.
All right. Thanks so much, Jana. Those were brilliant comments as well. Let's go to our last discussant, who is James Loxton. He'll be discussing Carlos Melendez's paper.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity to comment on this paper. When I got the invitation, I was really excited about it, and I was really happy to be given the chance to comment on Carlos's paper in particular, because I'm a big fan of his work, and so this is just great to be a discussant on this paper. By the way, my little dog, you can't see her, but she's sitting on the sofa behind me, and so if you see a little animal walking around, that's what's going on. She really wanted to come and be in the office with me. All right, I found this paper to be so interesting, and I found it to be interesting for a number of reasons. One is simply the topic itself of the paper. I mean, there's a huge literature on Fujimori's election in 1990, on the autogolpe in 1992, and on the Fujimorato more broadly, but there's relatively little on post-2000 Fujimorismo. There are things, but not nearly as much as you would expect, given the importance of the case. Here we have a country with over 30 million people, and this has been the most important party in the country for some time, and yet there's just not that much written on it. So by focusing explicitly on the topic of post-2000 Fujimorismo, I think that this paper and eventually the chapter that grows out of it has the potential to make a really important contribution. Something else that I really liked about this paper is some of the original data that it presents. There's some really great original data here about partisanship and negative partisanship or anti-partisanship in Peru. I found the stuff on pages 9 and 10 to be just terrific. Carlos presents some paper, some data about, how there's this, 9% or so of the population that's kind of the núcleo duro, the hardcore of Fujimorista supporters in Peru, and that's pretty constant actually. And as far as pisos go, 9% is not too bad actually, especially in a country with a very inchoate party system like Peru. Then you have, this 10 to 20% of Fujimorista leaners, and that's a bit more variable. And then finally, and I think probably most interesting of all, is this high and growing percentage of anti-Fujimoristas in the country, which Carlos points out constitutes, kind of remarkably, as he puts it on page 10, the most prevalent party identification in the country today. So the strongest political identity in Peru today is anti-Fujimorismo. I mean, that's just such an interesting finding. Related to that, I love just the stuff about negative partisanship in general. This is such an important topic, not just for Peru, not just for Latin America, but really for countries around the world. So this is a topic that has been explored probably in most detail in the context of the US. In Brazil, in the context of Brazil, we have the excellent Samuels and Suco book, which kind of looks at anti-pechismo as this strong identity in Brazil. But there's definitely room for more research on this topic. So I was really happy to see the topic of negative partisanship being explored in the context of Peru. I mean, again, just the idea that a negative identity can be the strongest political identity in a country, and by a lot, actually, that's pretty astounding. So there's some great stuff here. I'm confident this is going to shape up into a terrific chapter in the eventual book. There are some areas, though, as with any papers, especially first drafts, that I think are candidates for constructive criticism. And Carlos, I would encourage you to think about these moving forward. So let me just mention two. And by the way, these comments are all written up, so I'll just send them to you afterwards. So if you don't feel like taking notes, that's fine. Okay. So I'd like to make some comments about the dependent variable, and in particular, what is it actually? There are a number of potential dependent variables here, but I think you really need to nail one down. And then the second set of comments are about Fujimorismo in comparative perspective, and in particular, what happens when we compare Fujimorismo to other authoritarian successor parties in Latin America and beyond. So let's start with the dependent variable. So in terms of the DV, I was actually a bit confused about what the outcome was that the paper wanted to explain. As far as I could tell, there are three distinct dependent variables here. So two of them are contained in the title and subtitle. So the first is, as the title puts it, how to convert a populist heritage into a pro-establishment right-wing party. So, you know, there's this fascinating evolution from a populist party to an establishment party. How did that happen? That's a terrific puzzle. Then there's another dependent variable, which is in the subtitle, which is the resilience of Fujimorismo in the electoral arena. Again, a fascinating puzzle, but actually quite a different puzzle than the first one. And then finally, there's a third dependent variable, which you actually devote the first 4 pages to. And this is on what you call the pulverization of the right in Peru in 2021. I think a better term for what you're talking about there might be atomization. You know, why did the right atomize into all of these different candidates? Again, interesting puzzle, but actually quite different than the other two. All right, so all 3 are interesting puzzles, but I think that this paper and the eventual chapter would be a lot stronger if you really just focused on one. And in my view, the most interesting and original of these 3 puzzles is the first one. This idea that Fujimorismo has had this metamorphosis from populist movement to pro-establishment party. So if you look at the full arc of Fujimorismo over the past 31 years, it's simply astonishing. You know, in 1990, Fujimori was the quintessential populist outsider who promised to take on the country's pitucos and to be un presidente como tú, as he put it in his one of his famous campaign slogans. So that's in 1990. Fast forward to 2021, and here you have his daughter running, at least in the second round of the presidential election, as the candidate of the establishment of the pitucos, basically, against another quintessential outsider, Pedro Castillo. So Fujimorismo goes full circle from, you know, populist party to the establishment. And that transformation is kind of poetically symbolized in Mario Vargas Llosa's shifting position with respect to Fujimorismo, from Fujimorismo's most ardent critic to a grudging supporter. I mean, that's an extraordinary story. And I think that if you focused on this, it would just make for a terrific piece. It's intrinsically interesting, and it potentially has much broader implications for populist movements around the world. I mean, think about all of the right-wing populist movements in the world today, and then ask, you know, could they too eventually evolve in this kind of pro-establishment direction the way that Fujimorismo has? I don't know, but I would love to see you explore that question. So here, Peru could offer broader lessons, not just for the region, but potentially for other regions as well. The least interesting of the 3 dependent variables, I thought, was the stuff about the atomization of the right. To be honest, it felt a bit out of place, especially coming right at the beginning. It kind of seemed like it was from a different paper, and I just didn't really understand why that was there. So I would consider just cutting this, or if you don't want to cut it, kind of explain what it's doing there and incorporate it a bit more into the broader argument of the piece. All right, so those are my comments about the dependent variable. Now let me say a few words about where Fujimorismo fits in comparative perspective. So one of your main puzzles, one of your main dependent variables, is the resilience of Fujimorismo. And I agree that that is a fascinating puzzle if you look at Fujimorismo in a purely Peruvian context. So you compare it to other would-be attempts at party building in Peru, and, you know, it's not a strong party, but it's kind of the king of the hill. In a country where there are no parties, basically, it's kind of a party. So that's pretty fascinating. How did it do that? But, and here I'm just kind of being the devil's advocate. If we look at Fujimorismo from a cross-national point of view, rather than from a within-case point of view, we find that it's not that surprising, actually. What has happened is what happens in most new democracies. This is exactly what we would expect to happen. And by this, I mean, Fujimorismo is a case of an authoritarian successor party It emerged out of this competitive authoritarian regime and has continued to contest elections under democracy. Most of my research focuses on this topic, so I guess I'm biased. I find this to be an interesting topic. But if you look at Fujimorismo as a case of an authoritarian successor party, then you find that its resilience is really just par for the course. So, I put together some data that shows that in all third wave countries in the world since the third wave, in all third wave democracies, you find that in about 3/4 of them, there's a prominent authoritarian successor party, and in over half of all third wave democracies, that party is democratically elected back into office. And Latin America, no exception. Of the 15 countries that democratized during the third wave, 11 produced prominent authoritarian successor parties. Peru is one of them. And in 9 countries, the party returned to power democratically. So Bolivia, Chile, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, all send authoritarian successor parties back to the presidency in free and fair elections. So if you look at Fujimorismo from that cross-national point of view, it suddenly looks quite different. All of a sudden, the survival of Fujimorismo, far from being a weird and puzzling outcome, is simply exactly what we would expect, completely unsurprising. But what is unusual about Fujimorismo is that it has never been elected. That's the real puzzle, not the surprising success of Fujimorismo, but the surprising failure of Fujimorismo. Why is it part of this minority of countries in which the authoritarian successor party is not elected back into office? All right, I suspect you have a good answer to that question. I suspect it has a lot to do with your really interesting work about negative partisanship. I mean, a lot of people support Fujimorismo, but even more people hate Fujimorismo and would never, ever, ever vote for it. So that probably explains why it has been at least when it comes to returning to power, why it has failed. But I think that this is something that that you should wrestle with a little bit. I'm not saying that you should change this and make it and to have it be some kind of structured comparison or something. Absolutely not. I think it's perfectly fine just to focus on Peru, but to have a bit more of an implicitly comparative perspective, I think could strengthen the piece. And it could help to illustrate what is interesting and surprising about Fujimorismo and what is less interesting and less surprising about Fujimorismo. So again, I would encourage you to have some kind of an implicitly comparative perspective that takes seriously its status as an authoritarian successor party. I know I'm almost out of time, but just a few minor points. There's this huge literature, as you know, of course, about the Fujimorato and everything. I do think you need to cite some of that stuff. There, you have a few citations, but you need more. I would really encourage you to at least mention somewhere Catherine Conahan's 2000 chapter, "The Irrelevant Right," in the Middlebrook in the Middlebrook book on the right and conservative parties. Also, if you haven't done so, have a look at Levitsky and Mauricio Zavaleta's 2016 chapter, "Why No Party Building in Peru." They have a section on Fujimorismo. Another article that, if you haven't looked at it, I think you would really enjoy it, by Brandon Van Dyke from 2019, called "Why Not Anti-Populist Parties?" So he finds that populist movements often evolve into parties that exist for a long time. They can sometimes become pretty serious parties, but anti-populist parties are much rarer. Even though anti-populist sentiment is very common, including in Peru, as you show, anti-populist parties are pretty rare. So I think this would be a good thing to take into consideration. And then finally, just like Jana was asking about, what do we mean by the new right? I would ask, is Fujimorismo really a case of the new right? I mean, it has existed now for 31 years by Latin American standards, and especially by Peruvian standards. I mean, it's not new. It's old. It's an old right-wing movement, you could say. Perhaps what's new is this interesting point about how it has become more anti-establishment. But I would encourage you to think more about what you mean when actually you talk about the new right. All right. Well, but thanks again for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. I really enjoyed reading it. There's a lot of interesting stuff here, and I'm confident that it's going to shape up into an excellent chapter.
All right. Thanks so much, James. That was great. And also, thank you, everyone, for the fantastic timekeeping. And because of that, it looks like we might have some time to answer some questions. So I'm delighted. But first, let's go ahead back to the authors and see if we can get some quick reaction to the comments. And to do that, let's first start with Andre. So again, let's get some quick reactions, and then we'll see if we can answer one or two questions from the audience.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks, Juan Pablo, for your excellent comments. I think you're definitely right about your point regarding the use of expert survey data. We are actually trying to build some new measures for instance, the saliency of the liberal conservative dimension using individual level survey data. I think that that would be probably the best option if we could combine maybe expert survey data with also individual level survey data. Eventually, we will also use parliamentary elites surveys and definitely this is something we were already planning to do. I also think you have a point with regards to the need to take account of the dynamics of party system and party change in Latin America. Yeah, I think El Salvador is a good case that it's a case that demonstrates your point of very highly institutionalized party system, and then suddenly you have this right-wing populist presidential candidate that smashes the existing parties. Well, I personally think I mean there is no way we can solve that with a regression model. I think our model it's mostly an attempt at simplifying reality. But what I agree is that we should be aware of the limitations of our explanatory framework, and I think this chapter surely needs more. We should say more about like specific cases, to illustrate our argument. I think that would be a good thing that we might do. And so thanks for the suggestions. I guess I will not be able to answer all your points, but surely I think we will have a lot to do when we revise the chapter. That's it.
All right, great. Gabriel, if you have any responses to Juan Pablo's comments, that would be great.
Thanks. Gracias, Juan Pablo, por tus comentarios muy ricos. Sin duda es un problema la rareza de los casos. Como sabemos, los partidos nuevos exitosos son raros. Hay muy pocos partidos nuevos exitosos. El tema es cómo, de todos modos, esos pocos casos exitosos hay que explicarlos, y creo que ahí, digamos, PRO y Centro Democrático pueden ser casos exitosos explicados por los mismos factores. Por supuesto, ahí disentimos. sería largo dar mis explicaciones sobre por qué creo que esto funciona, pero sin duda, y lo mismo con el caso negativo del MDS en Bolivia, que sin duda nace en un contexto de fuerzas fragmentadas, como también nace PRO en un contexto de fuerzas muy fragmentadas en Argentina, con competencia de otros partidos que les va mal. PRO es la historia exitosa de una carrera en la que largan muchos jugadores. Pero bueno, digamos, esto implicaría más tiempo, así que digamos, me quedo en todo caso con los comentarios para profundizar cosas en el capítulo. Lo mismo con UDI y RN, que tienen viejos recursos que utilizan de su raíz autoritaria, pero digamos, también tienen nuevos recursos que tienen que usar en ese contexto que yo estudio. Mi foco histórico creo que es clave para pensar la selección de casos. Y sobre la cuestión de la amenaza roja, no me enfoco tanto en eso porque mi argumento tiene que ver tanto con la amenaza a Venezuela como con la amenaza ideología de género y otras cuestiones que tienen que ver con cambios culturales, con lo cual creo que el factor amenaza no solamente tiene esa dimensión roja, sino, como pasa en el caso de Colombia, por ejemplo, una sociedad muy conservadora en la que los cambios normativos los lleva a cabo la Corte Suprema, digamos, no un actor de izquierda, en fin. Entonces, en cierto sentido hay algo de santos en eso. Entonces digo, son amenazas cuyo efecto importa más que el actor que lo provoca para mi esquema. Bueno, y te agradezco nuevamente por las referencias, digamos, también, y por los comentarios, y voy a intentar clarificar lo más posible en función de lo que fuiste señalando. Gracias.
Great. Thanks, Gabriel. So now we'll go to Gabriela. If you have any reaction to Jenna's comments.
I have. Well, I'd like to say thank you very much, Jenna, for your helpful comments. I very appreciate them. And now I see clearly the problems you pointed, and I am already thinking how to solve. And thank you also for facing my bad English paper. And I think the first thing I have to fix is the name of these parties and replace new right parties for young right-wing parties to solve one of the confusions. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Great. And last but not least, if Carlos, if you have any response to James.
Thank you so much for your comments. Just two minor points. I mean, yeah, thank you for the references. I couldn't include all of them because, to be honest, this is the very, very first draft version of this work, so I couldn't include all of them. I am aware of the literature that you mentioned. And regarding the first part about the atomization, I think that's the right word to make references to what's going on in the right in Peru. I try to contextualize, to make the context about what is the situation of the electoral fragmentation now in Peru. But yeah, you're right. It includes more confusion to the point that I want to make, that is more focused on the development of Fujimorismo as a political organization. But thank you so much for all your valuable comments. I work on them in the new version of this paper. Thanks.
Great. Excellent. So it looks like we have two questions. I think we have enough time to get to them. I believe that one of them is for me and Andre, and the other one's for Carlos. So if we want to go ahead and start with Andres. Andre, if you want to respond, first of all, to the question, which I believe is now on the screen, then please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So it's a question by Fernando. To what extent this effect you found for contestatory left incumbents can be influenced by non-free and fair elections. Yeah, well, Fernando, I think that's definitely the case, because what we argue in the paper is that when you have a leftist hegemonic party, and you have an uneven playing field in which right-wing parties they enter electoral competition and disadvantage. Obviously, this is going to be much harder for a right-wing challenger to win elections. But that said, I don't think that we would get different results if we excluded cases of authoritarian elections, because we obviously in our data set we have some elections which, according to various different classifications, they cannot be considered democratic elections. For instance, you have several elections in Venezuela, which we cannot consider these elections as democratic, even if we rely on a very minimalist definition of democracy. But still, I don't think we would get different results if that's what you're asking. But I agree that this is something we need to work on, especially trying to answer some of the points that Juan Pablo made regarding the effects of the type of leftist incumbent on the strategies of the political right. I think that's it.
All right. And I believe the next question is, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the next question is for Carlos. Yeah. So Carlos, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, to what extent has the building of Fujimorista party rely on material factors besides the programmatic development you described? The problem with Fujimorista is that as an organization, it's a feeble organization. I mean, the organizational resources of Fujimorismo as, local committees, I don't know, like a territorial organization, is weak in comparison to other efforts of party building. But I mean, you're right. They have invested a lot of money, a lot of economic resources on building local committees throughout the country. But I think which is more interesting in the case of Fujimorismo is how they have crafted the party ID. And yes, it also implies economic resources in order to, to establish like a school for young followers of this political party. In this case, I can see and I can make the point that effectively economic resources have been important, relevant for the formation of political party. But as you know, in Peru, other political parties also has economic resources, but they haven't had the results that Fujimoristas had got. That's it. Thank you.
Great. So if I'm not mistaken, I think we have one more question. Who's it for? What are the intersections between these new right parties, individuals, and the traditional religious parties? Who should we throw this to? Should those two? Let's see. Andrea, I don't know if you have an opinion of who to throw this to.
Let me see. Okay, what are the intersections between these new right parties, individuals, and the traditional religious party? Mm. Okay, I think that's a good question, and I think this relates to Jana's earlier comment on the need to define. What exactly are we calling as the new right? I think when I look at the case of when I look at new right-wing parties or cases of right-wing party rebranding in countries like Brazil or Chile, Uruguay, I think it's very clear that you have a different kind of right-wing party that is more ideologically extreme. So in Uruguay, for instance, you have Cabildo Abierto, which is a populist extreme right party. In Brazil, you have the PSL, which is Bolsonaro's former party. And so I think you have this. I would say this is a new right in a sense because it is an anti-system right, and so it has to do with populism. But I would also say that you have a religious right. And this reorganization of the political right in Latin America, it has to do with the growing participation of evangelical churches in electoral politics. And this not necessarily means that these churches are going to create confessional parties. Not necessarily. Because in some cases, what is going on is that the traditional parties, they are going to make alliances with these evangelical groups, or they are going to move to the right in the liberal conservative dimension to mobilize these constituencies. And so I think when we are talking about the new right, I think it has to do with these two trends. On the one hand, the emergence of a populist, anti-system right. I think this is very clear in Brazil, but we can also see that going on in places like Chile, Uruguay, and also El Salvador, which is a case that I know much less about, but I think it also fits this trend. And on the other hand, the emergence of a religious neoconservative right. But I think these are the two, let's say, big trends, that are changing the landscape of the conservative camp in Latin America. I think that's it. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on this. Well, I guess this is a broad question that other presenters might want to say something about.
One thing I'll say just before I forget is, Hina, I think that you might find, you and many other people who have that sort of question might find very interesting one of our talks we're going to have on Wednesday at 3:30 Brasilia time with Amy Erica Smith, Mario Fuchs, and Matias Ferreira are going to talk about the religious right in Brazil in 2018 with the election of Bolsonaro. So I think that would be something you would very much be interested in, as we're going to go into a little bit more detail on that.
Good.
All right. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I suppose we can close it out, Andre.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to say thanks so much to all the presenters and to everyone and to the audience, everyone who watched us, and a special thanks to our discussants who I think those are some really excellent comments, and they're going to be really helpful as we put together this edited volume. So thanks so much to everyone. I don't know if you'd like to add anything else, Andre.
No, Ryan, I'm just gonna reinforce your and say thanks to our discussants, and just say that this was a really great session, and I hope that we will see the audience that was that has followed us until now. I hope you will attend the next sessions. We have another session on Tuesday, and a third session on Wednesday, both of them at 3:30 p.m. Brasilia time. So we hope to see you again. And I think that's it. We can finish here. Thank you all, guys, for this great session.